Good afternoon to those of you in Europe. Good evening to those who are further east. And to those joining us from across the Atlantic, good morning. Welcome to another RSAA webinar. Today, speaking to us from Hong Kong, I have the pleasure to introduce Herald van der Linde, whose book, Jakarta, A Misunderstood City, published last year and coming out in the UK very shortly, is the basis of his talk to us today. Herald van der Linde's family has connections with Jakarta going back more than 300 years. His own discovery of the city began 30 years ago, and it has been the center of life for him and his Indonesian wife for much of the time since. He is now HSBC's Chief Asian Equity Strategist, dividing his time mainly between Hong Kong, but also Jakarta, and he is speaking to us today from Hong Kong. To anyone who opens Herald's book, and I encourage you to do so, his affection for Jakarta and for Indonesia in general is immediately obvious, and his narrative promises, and I quote, juicy sex scandals, gory executions, a brutal massacre, an outbreak of deadly fever, not, I think, COVID-19, bungled uprisings, and murder most foul. And if that does not have you booking your next holiday there immediately, perhaps his account of a disastrous concert by the English rock band Deep Purple will do the trick. But for Herald, the fine-grained detail of the kampungs, the villages out of which Jakarta grew, that are its greatest attraction, and where he finds the people who populate his story. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome Herald van der Linde and hand over to him.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm going to share my screen now because I have a presentation ready, and I hope this is all good visible here. Let me see, I need to do the slideshow, I presume. Yeah. So we're going to talk about Jakarta and the history of this city, a misunderstood city because, as Michael mentioned, it is a city that I thoroughly enjoy visiting and being and living in. But most people have a very different perception of this city. So we're going to talk a bit about why should you read a book about Jakarta. I'm going to talk a little bit about the making of this book as well, how it came to be. We're going to then zoom very quickly through about, say, 1,000 years of history in a couple of slides to end up in what was called Batavia in 1800s. And then we slow down a little bit and look at how the city started to grow, evolve, but also how the problems and the challenges that the city faces today actually are mirrored in its history. Now, most people, when they think about Jakarta, a picture something like this comes to mind. If you've been to Jakarta, this must look very familiar to you. Massive traffic jams, difficult to get through. And if you're a businessman that only visits Jakarta, say, for 4 or 5 days in a week, and you stay in one of the hotels, you go around in this traffic, you have your dinner in the Mandarin or in the Hyatt, somewhere in the center, maybe your lunch in one of the other hotels. In between, you're again stuck in this traffic, and you go away with the perception that this city is just not something you want to visit. And I think that's actually a pity because Jakarta has got so much more to offer. I do admit that those traffic jams are quite horrendous at times, but actually a large part of the city, and in particular its people, are much more enjoyable than this picture shows. And I came to this particular realization myself about 30 years ago in 1990, when a much younger and slimmer version of myself, here on the left picture, went backpacking in Indonesia. My uncle had actually been in Jakarta and Indonesia years before me, and he told me, listen, if you go backpacking, don't go to Jakarta first. Just go to Bali first, and it's kind of a big city. You might get swallowed up by it. And that's what I decided to do. I had a couple of goals. I wanted to see some old megaliths in certain islands. This is actually on the island of Nias off the coast of Sumatra in the Indian Pacific Ocean. But I started in Bali and made first my way east. And on one of my travels in between islands, I was a ferry. And on the ferry was a 7-year-old girl, and she was sick, a bit of seasick, you could say. So I offered her some water, and I gave her simply some paracetamol, and thought that might actually help. Her parents came up And we tried to converse a bit, and I didn't speak really good Indonesian. I started to learn a little bit, but it was pretty basic at the time. So we just smiled at each other, and that was about it. About 2 hours later, the ferry arrived on the island. I wanted to go to the northern part of the island, walked off. There was a bus terminal nearby. And as I walked off, a car passed by, and the windows opened, they honked, the windows went down, and there was the family who was picked up by their friends and family who lived on the island. And they asked me where I was going for. I said, well, I'm going to go to A. They said, well, we go to B, but B is on the way to A. So why don't we drop you in B, and then you can make your own way? So I said, okay, I'll take that. So I went with them to the town, and but in the town, they had a small hotel, this family, that's where they were staying. And they said, well, why don't you stay with us a little bit longer, actually? And in the end, I spent about 4 days with them. They took me around the city. I met some of their family. They took me to some restaurants. I learned about Indonesian food. I learned some Indonesian words. So it was all very nice and enjoyable, kind of my first cultural experience. But after 4 days, I said, listen, I'm going to move on, backpack further to explore your country. And they said, well, if you come to Jakarta, let us know. And this must be 2 or 3 months later, I hobbled in the train into Jakarta, in Station Gambir, the central station, went to Jalan Jaksa, which is kind of a backpacker alley in Jakarta. And when I checked in, went to a phone station, a phone booth called Wartel, no mobile phones in those days yet, and called the family who lived in the southern part of Jakarta. They say, why did you check into a hotel? You're going to stay with us. So check out and wait for us. 2 hours later, they popped up with a car and brought me down to where they live. And this is pretty much the village. If I think about Jakarta, this is the kind of picture that I see. This is the entrance to the village, a small kampung where they lived, called Rawa Bambu. It's in Pasar Minggu. Pasar Minggu means Sunday market. I'll get back to that later on. And I stayed with them. And again, I only had the intention to stay there for probably a couple of days, look a bit around Jakarta. But in the end, that was extended to actually a couple of months. And I made a deal with them. So listen, I'd love to stay here with you because I can learn so much about Indonesia, but I don't really have any money to pay for you. You got a bedroom for me. You're very friendly. You give me all that food. Why don't I teach your daughter English and your son? It was really the daughter who was eager to learn. And in return, I can stay with you. And that was a good deal. So I stayed with them for a couple of months. If there were family parties, I would go with them. If there was anything in the kampung that happened there, I would join in. I got to know the people who lived there. And during my time, I simply took the bus around Jakarta. I just wanted to try to kind of get a grip of this monster of a city. So I took the train, the bus to all kinds of outskirts of Jakarta and made my way back throughout the day. And over time, I started to see that there was a particular grit to the city. So I came to like this place. And over the years, a couple of years later, I wrote my master thesis in Jakarta at the central bank. And again, I stayed in this kampung with these people there. My grandfather at the time told me once that my family had been in Jakarta. People had heard that throughout the generations, but nobody knew anything about this. So he says, while you're there, you should maybe go and check it out. So I went to the National Museum, didn't know where to start, thought that might be a good start. Asked them, my family was here. You guys got anything? You know where to look? And they basically said, no, we got nothing. So sorry. And I gave up. It was only years later, maybe 5-6 years ago, that I thought, why did I go to the National Museum? I should have gone to the city archives. And I went there. And I went and sat in the city archives. They gave me all these old, beautiful books. And I went through all the names of people. And suddenly, there was somebody had the same name as I, Johannes van der Linde. He had died in 1742 in Batavia. And he had been kind of a upper merchant manager, you could say, for the Dutch East Indies Company, quite a reasonable position within the Dutch East Indies Company. And I know for certain that this man was a family member because he was also mentioned in a family book that we have in the Netherlands. Not only that, in Batavia, it was mentioned that upon his death, they sent a large remembrance plate, a wooden plate, to a church in the Netherlands, in a city called Zwolle, in the eastern part of Holland. And when I was back in the Netherlands, I called the church on a Monday, I remember, And I said, listen, on Wednesday, we're going to be in Zwolle and I'd like to see if you got any records that wooden remembrance plate around. And they said, well, we don't know, but why don't you drop by? So when I walked that Wednesday with my father into that church and asked them, have you found anything? They said, well, we got something for you. You'll be surprised. We walked to the back of the church, and there was, for about almost 300 years, hanging the wooden remembrance plate. It says at the top that the gentleman, Johannes van der Linde, was the upper chiefman and head of some kind of administration at the castle. It's all in Dutch, of course. And at the bottom, it says he died in Batavia in the year of 1742 on the 15th of October. And he was only 35 years old, which actually a lot of people died at about that age in those years. And you can see a picture there of myself and my father as well. But as I went through the city archives, I found all kinds of other names of other family members as well. And some of them looked like were very much linked to him. The earliest I found was a lady called Barbara, whom I think must have been below 20 years old and arrived in Batavia in and around, say, 1650. You got to wonder what a girl really does in a frontier city. It was actually pretty much anything like that. In those days, sometimes women went there because you could marry richer men of kind of bigger stature, of higher class, if you want to think about it in that way, more easily than in the Netherlands itself. It could also be that she was simply running away from either a bad marriage or anything else in the Netherlands. So the question then really arises, how did the city look like in their days? And what kind of life would they have been? And as I understood the city, yeah, you can visit these places where they might have been. And yeah, the city of Jakarta, the history of Jakarta, and the history, of course, of my own family start to mingle together. And as I went through all these archives, I found all kinds of other stories. By accident, I came across a story of a slave that was so badly treated that people took the slave to court, or took actually her master, her mistress, a lady, to court for bad treatment of the slave. It was quite unheard of because it was quite common to treat slaves quite badly. But her ear, a part of her ear was torn off. Her eyelid was torn off. It took a surgeon about a week to get her ready to go to court. But while in court, yeah, they asked her what kind of life she had, and somebody wrote it all down, the court administrators, and you can read all of that as you go through these archives. It was fantastic. So more stories, not only my family, but other people I met as well. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about one particular guy called Jan Pondart. He's the second name at the top here. Was a watch and clockmaker. But I decided that maybe we should look at Jakarta the way I looked at Jakarta. I saw Jakarta through the eyes of the family where I stayed, the people that I had met, that it was these people that made this city so fantastic to me, not the traffic jams, but all the interactions I had there. And I wanted to show the history of Jakarta through the eyes of the people that lived in this particular city as well. So I started to collect all these stories. And as an academic historian, you might not be interested in some of these stories, but as a writer of a book in such a way, yeah, I was very eager to find a Balinese slave court, a lady that got murdered. There was a murder case in the 1920s. We're going to talk about this later as well. I found a Chinese traveler that arrived in Batavia in the 1800s and looked around with Chinese eyes. Quite odd. He found, for example, very odd that Dutch people would go to a building called a church on a Sunday, do not any business, be extremely serious for a couple of hours, jabber around, look down to the ground, sing kind of solemn songs, and then go out and get pretty much drunk in the afternoon, hang out and do party, and then be very serious again and do business on the Monday thereafter. He found that quite amazing. So through the eyes of Chinese, local people, slaves, richer, local people, Indonesians, and of course also people that still lived in the city that had been around there since, say, the 1940s or 30s, that are still alive. You could interview them and you can start to kind of weave a history together. Now, that history started with a small town, probably maybe in the year, actually there's evidence that people in Neolithic times already lived in what is now Jakarta. But there was, we know, a small kind of port called Kelapa. And Kelapa simply means coconut. So presumably there was some lanky coconut trees on the coast. It was a kind of a bay where this town was located. And it was simply a port where pepper and all kinds of other commodities were traded by the Javanese, by the Arabs, by the Chinese, by the Malays that lived in the archipelago, what now would be called Filipinos, you could say, but also later the Portuguese that arrived, the Dutch that arrived, and the English as well. So it came actually quite a bit of a cosmopolitan town. Eventually, the Dutch were there, they set up a warehouse. The English, they wanted to set something up there as well. To cut a story short, the English almost had control of Batavia. There was a fight. They were in, they had many more ships and weapons than the Dutch. It looked like they were going to kick the Dutch out, but by a stroke of luck, the Dutch got reinforcements just in time, and their method was to kick the English out, murder everybody who opposed them, burn the existing city that had been there, called Jakarta at the time, completely to the ground, and built their own city right on top of it. And this is one of the earliest maps of that city that they built there. We're looking here from north to south. There will be a couple of other maps whereby we look from south to north, and you can see the sea, the Java Sea here at the very bottom. There is a river that goes inland and bends, you'd say east, or on our picture leftwards at the top. You see the castle on the left side, behind the castle, the start of a city, and on the opposite side of that river, there's a couple of cows, not too much there, that would later be populated. And at the front, opposite the castle, you can see the customs house. People had to report themselves there when they arrived by boat in Batavia. This is around 1628, actually. So this is before my first family members arrived. And an artist for a museum in the Netherlands actually tried from this map and a couple of other maps to reconstruct a kind of computer image once. And I was able to use that. He gave me permission to use that. And I thought I quickly shared here. It's a beautiful picture. You can see the mountains in the back. That is where Bogor is located these days. You can see the clouds around the mountains, so that's where rain collects, of course, and the rivers would go down and end up right here in what it was now called here, Batavia. Beautiful kind of old picture here. Now, this is how it looked like by the 1650s. You can see that now both the east and the west side of the city are populated. There's churches, there are warehouses, there's an orphanage, there's a hospital. This is a kind of a proper city, you could say. But that's a typical Dutch city. There's canals in the middle. Most of the houses would be Dutch as well. And we have actually an impression how this city looked like, because right in the middle, you could say in the cross where the river and a road and an Amsterdam canal come together, is a viewpoint of Beekman's painting, because a painter in 1650 sat down and made a painting from that particular location. And this is the painting. It hangs in the Rijks Museum. Beautiful lanky palm trees here. You can see the fort in the distance. My suspicion is that he painted that fort a little bit bigger than it actually was, but maybe I was wrong. And on the forefront, you see a kind of a market here. And there are all kinds of different people. At the very front, at the very left, you can see two Chinese, seeming haggling maybe about something. A little bit further to their right is a Dutch couple with a sleigh behind them that has an umbrella to shield them against the beating sun. And a little bit right of them, there stands a kind of a dark guy with a black hat on, an orange striped shirt, and what looks to be kind of an old version of jeans, blue pants. That man is enlarged here. And you can see here that he looks kind of Indian in nature. He's dark. He's got a dark skin and he's got striped clothing. That was a particular kind of clothing that so-called freed slaves would wear. These freed slaves had arrived in Batavia from Malacca. The Dutch had kicked the Portuguese out of the archipelago by 1641 by kicking the Portuguese out of Malacca in Malaysia. A lot of slaves lived there. They were freed because they had become Christians. They decided to go to Batavia as well, and they entered the city, but they had to wear these particular dresses, and a lot of these slaves were Indian in origin, and you can see that a little bit in the way he looks like as well. These people were called freed people, or freed is merdeka in Malay, so they were called merdekas, or in Dutch, it turned into become maardijkers. Now, these Maardijker people, they were generally quite poor. So they lived in the poorer corners of the city, but also on the outskirts of the cities. And there they mingled with all kinds of other people. And later on, a unique culture would emerge from that, which we now call the Betawi culture. The original Jakartans are seen as Betawi. And there's a picture here. You can see two large red and white puppets there. That is so-called ondel. Those are large puppets that are used very often at celebrations and weddings. A lady and a man there in dress, but you can see the lady's got a traditional kind of Indonesian dress. There's a lot of Indian and Chinese elements in this culture as well, but also look at the dress from the guy. It's actually kind of a Dutch suit, so there's Dutch influences in here as well. But what is important to us is to quickly look at this particular map. You can see Batavia here at the top with the small castle in here. By the 1650s to say 1700s, the Dutch had negotiated with kind of hostile forces in Java not to go and attack Batavia. There had been a couple of attacks. They've been able to protect themselves quite effectively. The Javanese in the end were willing to agree to some kind of peace treaty, if you want to put it like that. And that made that living outside the city borders became increasingly kind of safe. And Batavia was a trading hub. That's where the money was made. So all kinds of people from the Indonesian archipelago arrived here and they lived together. So you can see at the very east part at the very west, you see KG Bali, Kampung Bali, that is. And that's where the Balinese went to live together. There, if you look a little bit around the map, you can also see Kampung Ambon, where the Ambonese people from the Moluccas live together. So all people from different origins cluttered together in kampungs. The Dutch, in order to protect that particular area, built 5 forts, and they built a canal to these forts. And of course, houses were constructed along these canals as well. And if we go from west to east, west to south to east, it's Fort Anke in the very west. If you go south, you can see a Fort Rijswijk, a Fort Noordwijk, which is a bit east of it. There's no particular canal there. There's a Fort Jakarta, which was what the area was called in those days, and a Fort Ancol, which is at the very east of Batavia. There were a lot of sugar mills in this particular area, and people moved out. But initially it was the poorer people that couldn't really live in Batavia. But over time that changed because Batavia became a bit of a city, overcrowded city. The canals were not well kept. The water couldn't flow through the sea. It went to all kinds of other areas. Now, if you got brackish water standing there, that's not good. Diseases came around. So by the time James Cook arrived in this city in 1776, Jakarta was overcrowded, hot, poorly organized, and full of diseases. And he hated the place. He was really glad to leave. There's actually a note in one of his diaries that he said that he spoke with a Dutch captain. He says, I'm losing half of my crew here. And the Dutch captain's reply was, yeah, there's a lot of disease going around, but if only half of your crew is dead, you're lucky. I've lost everybody here. So it became really a city. And the people who had money decided to move out of the city as well. That happened in the 1700s, 1740, 1750, 1760, and onwards. And they built phenomenally big houses there. And there are two here, which I want to show you, 2 large mansions. The first one, which is a drawing here on the very left, is called Weltevreden, which means something like very content. So the guy who made it must have been very happy with it. It was about 5 kilometers south of Batavia, close to Noordwijk and Rijswijk, those forts there. There were 2 fields nearby. It was a very nice location. And that is important because it became a kind of a center of where the city would grow in. Some of these mansions are still around, and you can see one of them here. This is the house on the right side, is the house of Reinier de Klerk, one of the governors of the city. It's now the Museum of National Archives, but it was restored in the mid-90s. I actually met the architect not so long ago. He's now retired, but the guy who worked on this. It's a beautiful place, so if you ever go to Jakarta, I very encourage you to look at it. It hangs full with all kinds of old maps and parchment and things as such, and there's a big garden in the back as well. And in the book, you'll find a nice story of a guy who lived there and threw massive parties for a reason that he was actually beaten up there once and eventually bought the house. It sounds odd, but there's a funny story in the book about this. But now we arrive, and we're going to stand still here for a second, in the 1800s. So the city was overcrowded, full of diseases. People moved out to Weltevreden, as I mentioned, and we see that in the smaller kampungs where the Balinese and the Ambonese and people from Sumatra lived, that they started to mingle as well, together with some of the Indian slaves there, and a kind of unique culture started to emerge, that Betawi culture. It wasn't really fully acknowledged until mid-1800s, 1850s or so, before that was actually considered to be a separate culture. And in the book, we look at the city at that particular point in time by looking at one particular guy who lived here, and his name is Jan Pondart. Jan Pondart was a maker and repairman of clocks and watches. In those days, in say, I don't know exactly when he lived there, but we're talking about say 1805 to 1813 at least here. I only know three things for sure about Jan Pondart. I know that he had a shop in 1830 because he made an advertisement, which is very difficult to read here, but it's translated and in the book. I know he had another advertisement about 10 years later, and he was on a different location. We'll talk about this in a second. And I suspect very much that his wife left on her own in 1826. So that was 3 years after the second advertisement that he put in newspapers. And I suspect that he probably passed away and that she decided to leave this town. Now, Jan Pondart, well before that, in say 1805, 1810, he lived in Batavia. And it made sense because if you were a clockmaker, the major business you had were all kinds of ships that arrived. Ships, in order to measure how far east they were from Greenwich, they had to figure out what time it was. They needed clocks to do that. And if these clocks were, they didn't function very well, they needed repairment, you needed to go see a guy like Jan Pondart. Now, Jan Pondart lived therefore just in Batavia, close to the harbor, and he must have seen quite a few things happening there. We'll talk about this in a second. We do know that in 1823, he lived much further south in Weltevreden because the city had moved there. Now, one of the things that he must have seen in 1811 when his shop was there is that things started to change in the city. And the origin of that is actually in Europe. Napoleon was going around, he had taken the Netherlands, so therefore the whole of what the Dutch controlled in Indonesia was under Napoleon control. He sent over a Dutch kind of army commander called Daendels to Batavia to take control over it, but in particular to defend it against what they thought was an imminent attack by the English. It wasn't completely imminent, but the English did arrive in 1811. Jan of Daendels, we have a picture of this man, is right here. He decided to do a couple of things. First of all, he said, we need to move out of Batavia. So the center of government is going to move a little bit further south. And he built a fantastic palace for himself. Unfortunately, he never lived in it. It took about 20 years to build this. It is now in the Ministry of Finance. Actually, by the time this palace was finished, they didn't really know what to do with it. So they made it a post office first, but it's now the Ministry of Finance. So that's the first thing he did. Secondly, he decided to build a large road from Batavia all the way to east and west along the coast of Java. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of Javanese probably died in the process of doing so. But he did that for military defenses. And that kind of postal road, as it was called, became the grid for what is now the Trans-Java Highway. If you drive along the Trans-Java Highway along the northern coast of Java, you actually follow Daendels Road to a large extent. Now, he was there for 3 years. People didn't like him too much. There were all kinds of nasty nicknames they gave to him. And just about when the English arrived to battle there, he was called back by Napoleon. A new governor who had no clue of what was going on there was installed. That probably helped the English, but to be honest, the Dutch-French army that was positioned there hadn't been in action for probably 200 years. So it took about 4 weeks for the English really to steamroll these Dutch armed forces, capture the governor and take control over Java. So the English were under control, and that was Raffles who took control there from 1811 to 1815. And Jan Pondart, our shopmaker, was located right in the middle because the English arrived on the east of Batavia and went First to the fort, the old castle. It was dilapidated by the time. Actually, the building you see here, the new Palace of Daendels, was built from bricks that they took from that old fort, that old castle. So the castle was only kind of rubble by the time the English arrived. And then they marched south, right along the road where Jan Pondart lived. So I can imagine that he stood out there with a pipe and seeing English soldiers pass by, knowing that the wind things would change quite dramatically soon thereafter. The English had to leave by 1815. There was an agreement in Europe on that. The Dutch came back. They put in place kind of fairly brutal agricultural policies, which made the Dutch and the Indonesian elite very rich, but Indonesian farmers extremely poor. But for the city of Batavia, it meant a lot of money was flowing in. People made a lot of money by buying things for cheap in Java and selling it into Europe, coffee, tea, you name it. And we can see that because this, not only did the city, the government move further south to Weltevreden and started to build these buildings, people started to move there as well. Commerce moved there. And after the English left and these agricultural policies were put in place, the city became actually quite rich. All kinds of luxuries were put in place. So the second advertisement that we have from Jan Pondart in 1823, he doesn't advertise that he's good in repairing clocks for ships anymore. He's gone on to make large clocks for people's houses. And he caters to the Javanese market. He says, send them over to me and I will make sure wherever you live in Java, you will get them back in extreme good condition. So he moved further south and the nature of his business changed as well from kind of maritime business to local domestic luxury, if you want to put it like that. And that is really a reflection of some of the changes that took place in Jakarta or Batavia in those particular days. One other thing that that Daendels did as well is to sell land to people, and they could start to build their own houses on it. So actually quite a nice city started to emerge. And this is important to understand. By the 1800s, these are two pictures which illustrate this to a certain extent. On the picture on the bottom, you can see part of the city. You see a large building called Sociëteit Harmonie that was kind of a focal point where people would come to dance, celebrate Queen's Day or King's Day, go and read newspapers, maybe play some cards or something like that in the evening. So it was kind of a local focal social point for the Dutch to get together. You can see that also tramways were put in place. Opposite that Harmony building, you can see a small building with a kind of triangular rooftop there. That's on the left. That's the right side of the Harmony building. That was actually a luxury fashion design shop called Ogre, and that reflects a little bit of the luxury that was going and the money that was going around in that town. But surrounding these areas where these Dutch lived, the infrastructure was very different. You can see at the very top here how a local kampung looked like. The Dutch houses had piped water. The Indonesians, they didn't get that. They had to pump it up. And this is important because as the city continued to grow, the infrastructure of piped water was never really properly put in place. And even now, most houses in Indonesia or in Jakarta, they have their own pumps. They pump the water from underneath the city up. And if you do that for a couple of 100 years and you put increasingly heavy buildings on top of it, the city starts to subside, it starts to sink. And this is one of the key problems that the city had. It needs to replenish that water supply that is underneath the city. But as long as that infrastructure is not in place, it will be very, very difficult to do. We now go into, I forgot quickly. Travel to Batavia became very big. This is a beautiful picture of one of the most luxurious hotels that was around. It was unfortunately, I think, torn down in, I think in 1957. I can understand why they tore it down. The Indonesians were not allowed to come in. But it was a beautiful, large hotel that was right in the middle of that area, literally opposite that Harmony building and the fashion shop that you see now. This is a picture from probably, I'd guess, somewhere in the 1920s or so. But this large hotels were built around the city. and this large hotel was one of them. Another hotel not too far away is where Raffles actually stayed for the duration of his time in Batavia. And then we go to the 1900s. It had been the practice that anybody who ruled Batavia or the Dutch East Indies had to be Dutch and had to be educated in the Netherlands, which came with the nasty side effect that a lot of these rulers had no clue of what was really going on locally. They were coming out of Holland and had to run this particular city. So by the 1850s and 60s, a kind of movement started whereby people asked for better education in the city. And the first school that was really of importance was what we call a gymnasium. Willem III was the king at the time. And that school is at the top here. It still exists in Jakarta. It's part of the National Library. You can see it at the bottom of the picture here, so you can still visit it. But the importance is that it gave access to university education in the Netherlands. And not only Dutch people went there, but also the clever children of the Indonesian elite who were able to get pre-university education in a language which was probably somewhat foreign to them. But as soon as they were able to get through the school, they went off to Holland and got to universities there as well. And some of these people came back and started to think rather independently and question why the Dutch were around. Some of them that went to this particular school, one of them was Tamrin, and now the large thoroughfare in Jakarta is called Jalan Tamrin, named after him. He decided to go into Batavia politics in order to try to improve the conditions in all the individual kampungs that had emerged. Jakarta continued to grow in those areas. And as I mentioned earlier on, you had the Balinese and the people from, say, Sumatra all living together. Small pockets started to populate around where the Dutch lived. Some of the areas, larger markets had developed, and these markets were held on particular days. There was a Sunday market. The area where I lived in Batavia, where I met my family, I told you earlier on, was in Pasar Minggu. That means Sunday market. There was a Wednesday market. There was a Pasar Senen. There was a Monday market. Connections were made between these towns and connections were made between these markets. And that formed the grid of the city. And to a large extent, even today, Jakarta can be seen as thousands of little small kampungs and towns. Even administratively, they are organized as such. Every small town has its own, what they call an RW or RT number. People organize themselves in these smaller kampungs. If somebody's sick, the people in that particular kampung will try to collect money and help them out. They will collect or make sure that the roads are clean. When Corona hit, people in their kampungs closed the roads to their own kampung just to control who was able to get in and who they didn't want to get into their small areas. So Jakarta was still kind of an agglomeration of thousands of these smaller kampungs. But back to that movement of national awakening of Indonesians questioning why the Dutch were there and why they wouldn't have more say in the ruling and the management of their own city. This is a picture of an area called Gondang Dia. It's a little bit further south of Weltevreden in Jakarta. It's now considered to be central Jakarta, just south of where the Merdeka Square is and the large national monument, if you know Jakarta. Part of an area called Menteng, you could say. You can see there's trams here, but on the left side, you see a lady in the white. And there's a road that goes in there and it's called Jalan Sawo. And in 1920s, in Jalan Sawo, there lived a lady called Joanna. She was 28 years old and had a husband called Leo. Now they themselves, for historical purposes, are not extremely important or so. It's not that they made big decisions in the city. They just lived there, and Leo tried to make his way up in the Dutch army, actually. But on a couple of days after Christmas, Joanna was preparing cookies together with her two helpers. She had an older lady that helped her at home, and she had a domestic helper, which was a younger boy. And the relationship with the younger boy, I don't know how old he's been. I guess it's maybe 15 or 18 or something like that. His name was Midas. Funny name, by the way. But Midas, the relationship with Joanna must not have been very good because she said something, he became very angry, took a knife and killed her. And he ran off. Within half an hour, the police was there. Within a couple of hours, the whole city knew that a lady was killed, a young Dutch lady was killed by a local helper. And the outrage initially to the police of not being able to locate him, it took him quite some time to locate him, was very big. But the outrage went on. And if you go and read about newspaper articles, the stuff that some of these people said is fairly outrageous. There is a letter from a guy in Jakarta who sends in a letter and says, we should take lessons from how the Americans deal with the black slaves in Virginia. You lynch these people until they tell you where this guy lives. In the end, Midas had run off and went to another city in Java, where by accident, actually, the Dutch police picked him up because he had a bicycle where his light didn't work. When they told him, hey, your light is not working, he seemed to react quite strange. They thought that's odd. They captured him. They decided to call Batavia and said, we have a guy, he's acting really odd. And he was sent back. And that's how they captured him, by pure luck, actually. But the important thing is here is that there was a massive outrage about this murder. Of course, the murder is extremely tragic, but the way people reacted, my impression is that at that particular point in time, the Dutch started to realize that the Indonesians and the kampungs that surrounded the area started to question what the Dutch were really doing there. The only thing they had is that they had no means to take control over their country or their city yet. That, of course, changed when the Second World War hit Europe. The Japanese came in. The Japanese actually gave the city the name that it has now, Jakarta. They wanted to wipe away as much of the signs of the Dutch as possible. So, for example, the name Batavia was abolished. They used the name Jayakarta, which was used before, or Jakarta, which was the name also of one of the forts that we mentioned earlier on. Jakarta seems to be difficult to pronounce for Japanese, so they said, can't we make it Jakarta? That was easier for them, and that's how the name Jakarta actually came into being from 1942 onwards. Well, after the Second World War, the Dutch tried to take back control of the city. Eventually, by 1949, they had to leave. The Indonesians took control over it themselves. Now, Batavia has always, through the ages, been a large money magnet. When the Dutch were there, the Balinese, as I said, and the Sumatrans and people from the Moluccas came there to make money and trade. This was always the place to make money. And after 1949 or 1945, there was nothing different. And if you go around Jakarta now, there are 3 pictures here. You can see people from all kinds of corners of Indonesia selling their ware. At the very top is a seller of martabak Bangka. Bangka is an island off the coast of Sumatra, and martabak is simply a pancake. Very nice, sometimes sweet, sometimes savory. Below it is a man called Surya who sells masakan Padang. That means Padangese food. That again is Sumatran. There's another picture of a guy who makes asinan, which is very much a Javanese, West Javanese speciality. So as you go around Jakarta, you can see all these, the origins of all these different people that mingled together. Now, to get a bit of a feeling of what happened with Jakarta, the explosion in this city, we're going to look at this map. And there's a lot of details here, and I don't want you to look at all these details. First, I'm going to show you where Jan Pondart lived first in north and where he moved his 2 towns. So you get a bit of a feeling what the size of the city was in 1810 and 1820. These are the locations where Jan Pondart had his shop. By the time we go to about, say, 100 years later, Joanna, the murder of Joanna, the city was pretty much this red area here. It had grown a little bit further, followed the river down to number 8, an area called Manggarai. I'm going to go back to this later on, and Meester Cornelis, now called Jatinegara. After the Second World War, this city needed to grow, and it was decided that a separate kind of satellite city was built called Kebayoran. It's now where it's close to the stock exchange. It's that green area there. It is now where a lot of foreigners also live, and ambassadors sometimes live there, also further in Kemang. But now the city, the official city of Jakarta, is as big as this area right here. So you can see that the city literally exploded in size, and that is the official area of Jakarta. Actually, surrounding it, there are other towns, Bekasi, Tangerang, Depok, you can see some of the names on the map surrounding Jakarta that have become pretty much a complete part of Jakarta as well. And people refer to it as Jabodetabek, Jakarta, Depok, Tangerang, Bekasi. It's kind of an acronym for all these towns all together, and it houses about 30 million people at the moment, Greater Jakarta. So it's a massive city, and it literally exploded. And of course, the infrastructure was not well put in place. As I mentioned earlier on, people still use all these pumps to get water up and deal with that. But these are the waterways in the city. You can see two rivers on the east and the west side of the city, the Bekasi River and the Cisadane. But right in the center is the original Ciliwung River. It then goes to number 8, where the water can go either left or right, you could say, east or west. That is the Manggarai Sluice. And if there's too much water coming from the mountains, they have to decide if it goes either east, west, or further north. And if it goes further north, you can see close to number 3, they can decide again if the water would go again east or west to further to the city. So if a lot of water comes down the Ciliwung River, it is not only that they have limited ways for that water to channel it, but it also becomes a political decision where it goes, because if they decide that all the water will go to the eastern canals, it probably means that the eastern part of Jakarta will be flooded. And if they decide to use the western canals, it probably means that actually the western part of Jakarta gets flooded. And if you try to move it further north and a little bit to the west, the presidential palace can be flooded. And that's exactly what happened in 2017. So yeah, to deal with this is not only a logistic problem, but also a political problem to a certain extent. Very briefly, maybe about Deep Purple. I think I'm running almost over time, but if you want to talk about it, we can do that afterwards in Q&A as well. Just to show how the city could not cope with a large project. Deep Purple arrived in Jakarta in 1975 to play in a large stadium called Senayan. It's still there. They had 2 concerts. They were there for 48 hours. In those 48 hours, they probably started to realize that things were really odd. When they got picked up, and there were so many people that wanted to see them along the roads that the army had to come in with tanks to guide them to the hotel. They were told that 50,000 tickets were sold, 125,000 people showed up. The 75,000 people that couldn't get in got really, really pissed off, started to burn down cars. So halfway through the first concert, they had to break it off, went back to the hotel, went to a kind of famous nightclub as well, called Tanamur, renegotiated the contract and said, you sold many more tickets than you told us. The guy who renegotiated that particular deal was found dead in the hotel. The police assumed that Deep Purple had killed their own person, put them into jail, got them into court in the morning. This is all within the first 24 hours that they were in Jakarta. They were able to presumably pay their way out, eventually gave the second concert, which again went horribly wrong. The army had to come in, police with Doberman, you can see a picture here. Shop houses were burned down. Again, they had to cancel their thing short, their concert short, went back to that nightclub, by the way, slept off whatever they had that night, went back to the airport to fly out, found out that the tire of the plane was a flat tire, had to pay $75,000 or something like that in order to reflate it, lost all their money basically in those 2 days, all the money that they made, they lost in all kinds of, in the nightclub, and paying for flat tires, paying off other people to stay out of jail. And within 48 hours, they left that city again. It was quite a thing. Jakarta is kind of the capital of heavy metal these days. Metallica came in 1993. I didn't go there, but my brother-in-law went there. I asked him once how that experience was, and he just sat down, he smiled, put up a cigarette, and he says, that was mayhem. He says, that was really, really bad. Again, the army got involved, tanks, helicopters, just to keep the crowds from burning part of the city down. There was actually a Metallica concert a couple of years ago with the president of Jakarta. That went much, much better. But yeah, Jakarta has made itself a bit of a name as the hard rock capital of the world, you can say. But this is very quickly the history of Jakarta, but also the kind of stories that yeah, you can expect if you take a look at this book. And the book is actually available already in Asia, but it will become available in the UK as well, in all kinds of bookstores by the end of next week. And with that, I hope I've kept to my time, probably run over a little bit, and hand it back to Michael.
Herald, thank you very much for that very engaging presentation. And as you have mentioned, your book is on sale. If anyone in the audience has had their appetite whetted and would like to buy a copy, you will find a link in the chat channel now. But I would like to invite questions from our audience. Can I remind people, please, to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen to pose questions to Herald, and we will do our best to ensure that you get answers. And to start questions off, I will turn to someone well known to many of the audience. Charles Humphrey is a long-standing member of the Society and a former British ambassador to Indonesia. Charles.
Thank you, Michael. Herald, thank you for a most interesting talk. I downloaded your book on Kindle last week and really enjoyed reading it. You've done a wonderful job in bringing out the history and character of Jakarta. And I think what you got absolutely right is you placed the people who live and lived there right at the center of the narrative. You showed, as you explained, that it was a city formed and molded over 4 centuries by outsiders, by generations of migrants who were drawn there both from overseas and from the whole Indonesian archipelago. The city today, of course, is facing huge problems: congestion, subsidence, flooding, ecological future. But it is a city that has forged something new of itself, as you explained, with the emergence of the Betawi population, who were a mixture of all those who'd come into the city earlier. It's the sense of being Betawi, of being a Jakartan. And of course, everyone who's lived there loves the liveliness and the kampung style local friendliness that goes straight to the heart of living there. Now, I'm sure lots of people have got various questions. I want to ask one that's intrigued me from my time in Indonesia. Indonesia has been remarkably successful in holding together a sprawling archipelago of different peoples and cultures. I mean, other post-colonial groupings are Spanish colonial South and Central America, British Indian Empire, East Africa, the British West Indies, Soviet Central Asia, even Malaysia, all split after independence to a smaller or larger degree. There can be many explanations for why Indonesia has held together, much to the surprise, I have to say, to some of the Indonesia watchers who I first talked to in the early 2000s. But one of them, I think, has been the role of Jakarta itself. And what I mean is Jakarta has always been multicultural and multi-ethnic. It would have been very different if the city had been, capital had always been Yogyakarta, because it would have been built on very central Javanese foundations and Javanese language-speaking people. But this was a city, Jakarta, that was made up of incomers. And what is more, within Indonesia, it's always seemed to me that it functioned as bringing together the brightest and most ambitious people from all over the archipelago, and it's taught them to live and work together successfully in what has always been the central powerhouse up to now of Indonesia. And I just wondered if anybody else with their experience of Indonesia shares this view or has another view on this.
I think that's a very interesting, actually, proposition that you put here, because you are right. Jakarta has always been a magnet. So all kinds of people from all over the archipelago have come there. And in a sense, it always needs to balance the opposites. There will be Christians, there will be Muslims. There will be people who are very progressive. There will be people who are much more conservative in their view on life. There will be rich, there will be poor. And somehow, Jakarta is able to melt these opposites somewhat together, and these people are able to live together. And maybe to a certain extent, that is a contributing factor to Indonesia sticking together. It's difficult to say if that is the case. There are, of course, other areas where you can point at as well. For example, the education, the national language, the emphasis on Pancasila, a kind of a state ideology after independence, might have meant that most Indonesians first and foremost feel themselves Indonesians before they feel themselves Javanese or Sumatran or anything like that. But a lot of that will come together in Jakarta. And you can see that sometimes in the policies that are being forged nationally, but which are being debated and discussed literally on the street sometimes in Jakarta. There have been proposals at times for kind of what people could say stringent religious rules to be put in place. Actually, one of these proposals was right at the start of independence, when Sukarno, Hatta, and other independence leaders sat down together over one night to figure out what the Declaration of Independence should be. And there was a group of people that wanted to be enshrined in that declaration, that it would be an Islamic state, that Islamic laws would be applied. They decided not to go for it because it would probably, and most likely so, alienate large parts of the archipelago. That charter, it's called the Jakarta Charter, was actually thrown out and was not applied for the sake of keeping that country together. So to a certain extent, you might well say, yes, that Jakarta has been a magnet. It attracted all the people, but they also had to live together. And all these opposing forces somehow balanced out, live together, next door to door, literally sometimes in Jakarta.
Thank you. We've got a group of questions, all on essentially the same point, which is the future of Jakarta, bearing in mind that it is sinking. I mean, I will condense three questions into one, if I may. First of all, I think it was reported as sinking at a rate of something like 25 centimeters a year, which is prodigious, if correct. First of all, is that right, and is it ongoing? But more generally, assuming that the government proceeds with its intention to move the capital to Kalimantan, what does that mean for the future of Jakarta? Is it likely to remain a commercial center, or is its environmental future so fragile that even that is not a possibility?
Well, let me break and unpack this a little bit. So first, on the sinking of the city. The city basically is at the very north, below sea level. That's where it's sinking. And then it goes up gradually on an upward slope, because Bogor, at the very southern part of the city, is literally on the hills of the mountains. My family lives further in the south. There were floodings last week in Jakarta, 2 weeks ago, but not in the areas where they live, because they live much higher. So the city, yes, sinks 25 centimeters a year, but only in certain parts, in particular the parts that are much closer to the sea. Other parts, this is much less so of an issue. But of course, the people that can avoid that, they move further south, and the people who can't still live in these northern areas. So income inequality is very much linked to this as well. There is actually a large wall that is being built in the very north of Jakarta to keep the sea out. And as long as that wall doesn't break, people can continue to live there. If it breaks, it will have very, very nasty implications for the northern part of Jakarta. That sinking continues because this is to a large extent driven by the absence of good water infrastructure. People still pump the water from underneath the city up. Even my own family live in houses where they have their own pumps. Everybody has that. And it's not that these houses are small. These are well-to-do Indonesians and large houses that they have. So that is something that needs to be addressed. I spoke once with somebody who looks at city planning, and he gave the example of Rotterdam, of how they could deal with this to a certain extent. Part of the problem of flooding is that all the water comes from the mountains. It has to make its way through Jakarta, as I illustrated. What they've done in Rotterdam is in the surrounding areas to make new kind of lakes which are low-lying and half full. So if there's a lot of water, you can divert it there, and there are larger capture areas. And in the city, you can make smaller capture areas. In a small kampung, for example, if you get a badminton field, and there are thousands of these badminton fields around Jakarta, it's a popular sport. If you would lower that by a meter or a meter and a half, that could become a capturing area in times of flooding or excessive rain as well. Becomes like a badminton pool, if you'd like to say as such. So there are these kind of solutions that might be around. The problem very often is not the ideas, it is the money to get that done. Insofar we talk about the moving of the capital, other countries have done this. Indonesia was planning to do so. Of course, Corona has changed a lot. A lot of money needs to be put away for healthcare now. So all of that might be delayed a little bit. I actually think it could turn out to be positive for Jakarta. The problem for Jakarta is that it's such a large magnet that too many people try to pack themselves on too little land. And as other parts of Java have developed with this Trans-Java highway, factories and employment opportunities start to emerge in other parts of Java as well. And if you move a capital to Kalimantan, employment opportunities will eventually emerge there as well, although the whole city still has to be built. So we're not talking about 1 or 2 years or so when this is going to happen. But it would alleviate some of the pressure of Jakarta, because I cannot imagine that Jakarta would not remain the cultural center of Indonesia for quite some time to come. This is where, if you are ambitious in Indonesia, this is where you want to go. This is where the most talented architects, dancers, entertainers, computer designers want to make their mark. And that kind of attraction, magnetic attraction of Jakarta, that will remain in place for quite some time to come. But any other opportunities to alleviate the pressure on Jakarta, I would actually consider that to be a very welcome development for the city and for the country as well.
And just sticking with that sort of theme in a way, a sort of couple of questions from William Crawley. One you have touched on already. He asks whether the Netherlands has used its own expertise in water management to help Indonesia address these problems. And you've already alluded to some dialogue going on there. But the other question that William asks is, has there ever been an attempt at drawing up a master plan for the city?
There have been master plans. So there were massive floodings in what was still Batavia in 1915, I believe, 14 or 15. And plans were put up together to construct kind of canals. Some of these canals have been built. That's what I mentioned earlier on. Canals that went east and west through the city. But it wasn't further built out. The problem was that after 1945, the city literally exploded in size. So even the master plans that were available before 1940s, they would have been only covering too small an area to deal with the size of the city that the size of Jakarta that emerged in, say, the 50 years thereafter. And the city planners were not able to keep up. And as I said earlier on, there have been different plans, but very often the focus of these plans, in particular in independence, was more about showing the pride of being independent. Sukarno put a lot of effort into making national monuments. Jakarta is littered with all kinds of statues with people with their hands in the air, screaming of freedom and happiness, and national monuments and these kind of things. So a lot of money went in that direction for, again, understandable reasons maybe as well. But it meant, that couldn't go to kind of small canals or catchment areas that you wanted to build. And the other problem, of course, is you can have plans, but you need a lot of money. And that is the other problem that a country like Indonesia faces. It just doesn't have that money. It needs that foreign capital to finance that. But if I can add to this very quickly, I also think this all sounds really bad. The city is sinking. It doesn't have the money. Why? It's all moving. I'm quite optimistic about this city, because we think about planning very often from a top-down perspective. But in the book, the last chapter, I try to go back to how the city was formed, and there was all individual small kampungs. And these people live together and organize their kampung in their own way. And as I said, they have their own numbers, even these kampungs, RT or RW names, numbers. And in these individual kampungs, there are small solutions. If each individual kampung keeps its gutters clean and the other one next door does it as well, the water will flow much better. If they plant trees, and some of them started to do so, if there was a married couple in a kampung, you had to plant a tree somewhere, and other ones took it over. You get a much greener city. So by making all of these smaller kampungs do micro decisions, but having thousands of these kampungs doing that, you actually get from the bottom up a lot of solutions as well. And Jakartans and Indonesians in general are incredibly creative people dealing with a lot of adverse conditions, the flooding and all these kind of things every year, but they're making the best out of it. And I think, yeah, that spirit coming from that kampung is very important for the future. It will save this city and will come with thousands of small solutions that somehow allow this city to continue to grow and be what it is.
I'll come back to that question of the future in a moment, but I have a very specific question about one building from Jakarta's past. Juliet Campbell asks, can you tell me what happened to number 1 Jalan Imam Bonjol, where the Declaration of Independence was signed and which was the residence of the British ambassador until taken over by the municipality?
I think the building that she refers to, were actually during the war, was the Japanese general lived in it. It is now a museum for the Declaration of Independence of Indonesia. And so it was used, as I said, by this Japanese general. That's where the declaration was signed. No, sorry, the declaration was eventually was declared somewhere else. There is not a monument for that, but a museum was made out of it. If I'm not mistaken, that is the building that she's referring to. That's Imam Bonjol. And it's actually quite a nice 2-story house, a nice small museum. And you can see the discussions that went on, but they also got figures and photos of Sukarno, Hatta, and Sultan Shahir, who were all there. I'm not quite sure if he was actually there, but all the other players in that area. So that's still there. If I'm responding to the wrong building, then I say that lady can maybe through you email me, and I will come back to her if I'm referring to the wrong building for her.
I'll do that, certainly. We've got quite a lot of questions here, so I'll just say now that we are getting close to time. We'll try and cover all of the ones that I've already got. First, from David Fall, is there any interest, he asked, these days in preserving aspects of Batavia's or Jakarta's built heritage? The Harmony building, the Hotel des Indes were not thought worth saving in their time, but is there much left, and does anyone want to save it?
Yes. So some of these buildings are gone, and yeah, after independence, I guess you have a moment in time whereby a nation says, we don't want these symbols of oppression to be around anymore. And you can say, well, that was a pity or not, but I can understand that as well. We're now a good, 70 years almost after independence, even more. And in Indonesia, there is a larger movement is a big word maybe, but a bigger feeling of restoration and heritage. The northern part of the city, the old Batavia, has under the stewardship of Jokowi, when he was the governor of the city, has been refurbished, you could say, to a certain extent. It's become a touristy area where locals, to a large extent, go through. The history of Jakarta, there's a museum there, there's a wine museum. As I mentioned, there are also other private sector initiatives. So there is a group of people that buy buildings, they collect money, buy buildings, and restore them. And I myself actually am part of a group of people called the Heuken Institute that tries to identify all kinds of new buildings around Jakarta and see if these can be restored as well. We need to speed this up, and whenever I go back to Jakarta, I hope as soon as possible to start this particular project, because even in the area where my family lives, there was an old Dutch building that was torn down. Even the locals wanted to preserve it, but the one who had bought it, the developer, just on a Saturday morning had the bulldozers come in and tear it down. And it's not just the Dutch buildings that we need to restore, but there are Chinese temples, there are Muslim mosques, there are all kinds of other buildings that have been there a long time as well. So I think there are initiatives. Some of them come from the government, but there are some private initiatives as well. And anybody who's actually interested, we were looking for architects that have experience in this. Anybody who has any interest in this, they should contact me and I can get them in touch with the right people as well. So hopefully we can do a little bit more on that.
Good, thank you. I mean, we've got a couple of questions about, well, about inward investment, I suppose, of two different kinds. Peter McKinnon asks, are the Chinese likely to step in if money is needed? What is the state of Sino-Indonesian relations? And the Belt and Road Initiative is something that this organization has devoted quite a lot of time to over the last couple of years. It's obviously relevant there. But the other element of this, to look at non-state actors, Anwar Mahbub asks, there are big names, Jardines, for example, and others actively investing in Indonesia. Do you see the Indonesian economy as able to overtake its neighbours? What are the macroeconomic prospects, I suppose?
Yeah, well, first on the Sino-Indonesian relationships, very quickly, relating it maybe a bit to Jakarta. So one of the Belt and Road projects is a high-speed train between Jakarta and Bandung that is supposed to be put in place. Plans are there, the money is actually there, but there is some kind of disagreement about if things would go wrong and currencies move, who would take that particular risk? And those discussions have been going on for quite some time, and the project therefore is really not moving anywhere. So yes, it is part of Belt and Road, and for China, Indonesia should be a strategic kind of country to invest in. It's a large domestic market where they can sell their products. It's a large player in ASEAN. So it's something that they zoomed in on. And you can see that in some of the financial terms that the Indonesians were able to get. It was better than some of the other countries in the region. As a strategist, I've looked at that a little bit in the past. But those relationships are also strained, of course, at times, and this has got more with the rest of Indonesia in terms of what is Indonesian, what is Malaysia, and where does China stop? And this comes to the 9 dots on the Chinese maps. As for the economic question, can Indonesia overtake? In my own view, the Indonesian population is quite young. It actually flattens out by 2040-ish, so it doesn't really grow that much further anymore. So what it really needs to do is to increase the productivity, and for that we need to see bigger investments in education. That is improving, I think, in Indonesia, schooling, but if they could make more out of that, maybe the productivity of its labor would go up, and that would attract, I believe, much more capital. But that is easy to say as an economist or strategist here, but we've just mentioned that they also need money for healthcare, and they also need money for those canals, and they need money for income inequality. So this comes back to the problem a lot of emerging countries have, and Indonesia is no exception here. A lot of money is needed, limited as money that is around, priorities need to be set. And how do you weigh that up? But I think investments in education would go a long way of improving the macroeconomic aspects of Indonesia.
Thank you. We can't go on for much longer, but there are quite a few questions still outstanding. One of these is perhaps related to the subject that you were just talking about. Martin Evans says the Transmigrasi program was a huge official effort to reduce the population of Java by resettling people in the outer islands. It was at best a mixed success. Is there any reason to believe that relocating the capital will be more successful?
Let's be optimistic and hope that it will be more successful, but transmigration has proven to be slightly more complex than maybe what the initial planners hoped it to be. all kinds of cultural and other local issues come into play when you put different people together. But we got to remember that there is a lot of talk about the building of a new capital in Kalimantan. About a year ago, I met with construction companies involved with it. They were building a road to where the city is going to be built. The city itself is still just land. There is nothing there. It is not that there are buildings being constructed and we're halfway through building a city. At the moment, they're cutting the trees down and then building a road inland in order to get to the location of it. So it will take quite some time before a real city starts to merge there. And I suspect it's very much going to be mid-level employees and not the top decision makers in the country that will move to that city. Maybe we're talking about way into the end of the century, well beyond my lifespan, when that might all change. But I think we're talking decades out before that might change. Jakarta will remain the place where all the decisions will be made.
Thank you. I mean, just coming back, I'm just going to ask two more very short questions, but coming back to your focus on the kampongs. Anthony Wynne asks, do the kampongs work together with their neighbours? Is there a sort of collaborative manner in which these communities work, or has that now all been absorbed into a larger metropolis?
No, actually, it is very much the case that these kampungs work together internally as well as between kampungs, but very much internally. There's even an Indonesian word for it. It's called gotong royong. It means mutual help. So if in a kampung, let's say you got 6, 7 streets, I'm just making this up, but you got maybe, say 100 households, a couple hundred people living there, there will be a local head. He will have a book with all the names of all the people. If there is somebody who's sick and can't pay for the hospital, people say, you know, I chip in $1, you chip in $1, and everybody chips in to help that particular family. There will be other initiatives that take place. If somebody passes away, the head of that kampung, the head of that 100 houses, will go and visit as a representative of the rest of the kampung to the family, these kind of things. So there's a lot of mutual help within these kampungs. And as I said, what we also see is that some of these kampung has come up with kind of creative ways with dealing with flooding or subsidence and all kinds of other issues. And as long as that gets into social media, you see that other kampungs sometimes take that over. So there was, for example, the initiative of planting a tree if somebody married. And I saw that in other parts of Jakarta that was taken on. I'm not quite sure if they still do it, but for some time that was a bit of a movement in Tangerang, in the western side of Jakarta, to do that.
Thank you. I'm the last question from William Keeling, who I divine from the question knows Jakarta. He asks, has there ever been a better nightclub than Tanamor?
So that is, I might tell William Keeling where he could maybe go now these days, but Tanamor, indeed, this is where Deep Purple ended up in that trip that they made. Has for a long time, I think it closed somewhere in the early 2000s, be the nightclub to visit. That's where almost like a microcosm of Jakarta itself, all kinds of different people would show up there. It was located in Tanah on the street. It was actually an abbreviation of the name of the street where it's located. But I dare to say that there has not been a better nightclub in Jakarta than Tanamor, and I suspect Mr. Keen there will very much agree with me on that particular front.
Thank you. We need to close on that note for this week, I'm afraid. My apologies to a couple of people whose questions we haven't managed to reach. There were an awful lot, and thank you very much indeed for sticking with us, Herald, because it was quite a long session. We will be back.
And also, if there are questions, they can always email me.
Thank you. I hope people have taken note. We will be back on the 3rd of March when Professor Jörg Matthias Determann will be talking on the topic Muslim futurisms, science and the imagination across Asia. Details are already on the RSAA website and the usual notices will be going out tomorrow, so please look out for that. For now, it simply remains for me to thank Charles Humphrey for his contribution, you, the audience, for being here, and most of all, very warmly, thank you, Herald van der Linde, for what has been a very colourful and insightful talk. And I hope to see you all back here in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.